organizations approach their product design process can have a significant impact on competitive advantage. Giving sufficient thought to the various design elements, such as product shape, weight, dimensions, raw materials, even compatibility, to name a few. That's going to greatly impact the extent to which an organization will succeed in creating and sustaining competitive advantage, and by extension, of course, profitability. So thank you for joining us. My name is Ahmed Ghannoum. It's my pleasure to walk you through today's webinar, where we will be taking a look at the interrelationship between product design and competitive advantage vis-a-vis supply chain thinking. Now, today's webinar will be delivered in 3 short parts. First, we'll be defining competitive advantage, and we'll look at the different types of gaining competitive advantage. In this first part, we'll look at, of course, the 2 broad avenues that we can take, typically product differentiation and cost leadership. In the second part, we introduce the concept of design for the supply chain. That's the big headline today. And here we look at when and why it's relevant to create competitive advantage. Finally, part 3, we'll be examining the various drivers of creating competitive advantage through design for the supply chain thinking. We'll be looking at 5 specific variables over there. So let's start straight with part 1, which is on competitive advantage. Now, if you go on Google, if you search competitive advantage, you can find many different models that companies typically follow or pursue to create a competitive advantage. But these can be really grouped into 2 broad themes by and large. The first one being differentiation, and the second one being cost leadership. Now, when it comes to differentiation, we're looking here for creating a unique item, okay, or a unique service, any offering really, that is going to be different, even slightly so, than what your rivals in the market are offering. And typically when you differentiate, that's going to cost money, that's going to add to your cost structure. So pricing might be here at a premium, but our focus is going to be largely on that first part, which is creating the unique offering. What this really means is that our cost structure is going to take a back seat, especially as we're targeting customers who are going to be less prone to price sensitivity over here. Now, the other form of creating competitive advantage is, of course, cost leadership. And over here, when we say cost leadership, it's just another fancy way of saying cheap. Okay, so we're selling a very slightly, or sometimes even slightly differentiated, or sometimes even a commodity in its vanilla version. And usually, what we're trying to achieve here is a cost structure that is lower than that offered by or attained by our rivals. So this is typical, like I said, of commodities where the consumer is less concerned about brand names than they are about pricing. So things like oil or chemical enzymes or even sugar. Okay, like take sugar, for example. When was the last time you looked up the brand of a sugar you were offered when ordering a cup of coffee? That doesn't happen too often, does it? So customers would be perhaps willing to change supplier almost purely on the merit of a lower cost structure. Now, cost leadership applies, of course, not just to commodities, but it also may apply to, let's call them value products or value items that are nevertheless going to be on the lower end of the price spectrum. So I'm thinking IKEA, I'm thinking Zara over here. Now that we've clarified what competitive advantage is, let's move on to the second part, which is design. So let's talk a little about design. And let's say you work for an organization and you're trying to create a new product in order to sustain customers, to sustain sales into the future. So when your product design team or your product development team sits down to create a new product, where do they start? What do they want their product to do? Okay, what does the product need to tell your people or your market? Where do you go really for inspiration? Now, there's no shortage of places you can go for design inspiration, really. One is certainly quality. Okay, so you might want to build a product that is of high quality. But if you pursue that route with little or no regard to anything else, you might find that you might actually achieve, okay, or end up creating a high quality product. But you might find that it's actually prohibitively expensive to build or to create. Maybe because you're not focusing on your cost structure, or you might find that you're going to have some issues sourcing the raw material for that product, either because it's just difficult to source, or because suppliers are geographically located in faraway places. That's going to make your deliveries less reliable. Another focus might be, I'm focused on quality, I miss out on, let's say, the carbon footprint, okay, because it's too high, and the list goes on and on and on. So you have a quality product, but you have a lot of issues with that product. Another approach is we're looking for design for compatibility. So you might want to create an item that is compatible with other items that are already owned by the customer. Okay, so this could be, a software to work on specific hardware. It could be the tip of a razor tip to work on a razor handle that you already have at home. You can also go for sources of other sources of design inspiration, such as durability. Okay, I mean, all of these, designing for the environment, all of these can be attained if that was your only focus. But in reality, it's going to be a lot more complex than that, because as a company, to be sustainable, you don't just need a reliable item, but you need to be able to produce that at a cost-effective manner, and increasingly so nowadays, with more with an eye on the carbon footprint that the item is going to leave throughout its life cycle. For design and for the environment specifically, keep in mind that the approach or the premise for the approach should be that saving the environment and reducing costs should not be regarded as mutually exclusive. That is to say, they can coexist. Okay, so a simple example could be, you decide to go paperless. So no paper obviously equals a happier earth, because there's no production, there's no waste. No paper also equals a happier purse, because there's a cost avoidance saving that you are achieving over here. Now, again, there are many other sources for design inspiration. The one that we are interested for the purpose of today's webinar is, of course, design for the supply chain. Now, what does design for the supply chain have to do with competitive advantage? Well, if we go back to the two broad areas for creating competitive advantage, which are differentiation and cost leadership, design for the supply chain can be actually used to support both strategies. Okay, so I'm just going to walk you through examples of each, starting with differentiation. And over here, I'd like to talk a little bit about Zara. Okay, one of the most, if not the most successful clothing factory or clothing clothes producing companies out there. Now, Zara, if we just make two lists here, okay, one list that talks about the supply chain features that are implemented by Zara. The second list that looks at the impact of those supply chain features on the design of the product that the company actually produces. So let's go through the first, the supply chain features. The way the company sets up its supply chain is made to serve, okay, short lead times for delivery, first of all. So the second thing is short production runs. So scheduling at Zara's production plants is made twice weekly. So compare that to once every 3 months or once every 6 months. Compare when you look at their competition. They have just 50% of manufacturing produced in advance. So here we're talking about postponement. Rather than create the whole product and store finished products, what they do is they create 50%, okay, of their garments ahead of time. And then the last step in the production process, things like dyeing, coloring, that is left until after they receive the orders. And what that does is it gives them a lot of flexibility going to market. At any one time, Zara limits the type of fabrics they're using. So we're point four, number 4 here, to 4 or 5 fabrics. So they would procure large quantities of only 4 or 5 fabrics. This saves them a lot of money. It also saves a lot of time, and it also helps reduce the number of SKUs they are dealing with, at least at the production process. Garment finishing done in-house, like I mentioned earlier. This is through postponement as well. And local supplier network. So Zara procure the large majority of their sources from the country where the plants are located or from neighboring countries. So in Spain, for example, where they have their main production unit, 80 or 90% of all raw materials procured from Spain, Italy, and a couple of other neighboring countries. Finally, rather than focusing investments on advertising as their competitors do, they actually focus investments on the creation of new stores. And what this does is that it helps expand the supply network, making it easier for the clients to access their customers. Now, what's the impact of all of these features on product design or on the way your customer actually perceives your products? Well, first of all, Zara has 12 to 18 product lines per year. So that's like saying they have a new collection every 2 to 4 weeks in their outlet stores. Now, again, that's comparable to their competitors who would have 4 to 6 product lines or fashion lines per year. At any one year, you're going to find over 10,000 items in their store. So that's a lot of variety for the customer to choose from. And that's part of how they differentiate, part of how they generate their competitive advantage through differentiation. They have designs that are in touch with micro trends. So what Zara do is they have a few people on the roads with cameras. Nowadays, it's mobile phones, of course. And these people are just taking pictures of different people dressed in different fashion items, different colors, different designs, and these photos are sent straight to the design room, where within 2 to 3 weeks that design is the next influencer in producing the next items to go to market. Again, cheap delivery, that's to say cheap finished products, and this is of course thanks to things like limiting the number of fabrics in the market, things like postponement, even things like short production runs that give them a lot of flexibility to gear their machinery towards producing what the market wants today, not what the market wants over the next 3 months. And of course, easy access. So easy access comes from focus on new investments in their stores. So that's basically an example of how design for supply chain can be used to help differentiate. The other example is on cost leadership. So how can we use smart or design for the supply chain thinking in order to achieve cost leadership? And I like to talk about the famous Japanese watermelon, the cube-shaped watermelon. Now, if you are a consumer, okay, and you are looking to procure a watermelon for your own personal consumption, and you spot that at the supermarket, it does not really look too natural. It doesn't look really appealing. But you know what? That watermelon was not produced to look like that so that it could actually appeal to the taste. That was done there in order to help attain the competitive advantage that is cost leadership. The way they get to that shape is by having the watermelon inside a plastic box, and as it grows, it takes the form of that box, and the end product is a standardized set of watermelons that all look the same, have the same weight, and have the same shape. Now, what does this achieve? Well, first of all, having cubic shaped watermelons makes it easier to handle. So rather than having to at the warehouse, having to pick up the watermelons one by one. What we can do now is we can stack them on a pallet. You can stack them high, and you can move them using a forklift without a risk of rolling over. They're cheaper to store and cheaper to ship because there are simply no gaps between the different watermelons. So if you have two round watermelons next to each other, there's a lot of gap, which is dead space. When they're cubes, you minimize all of that. Believe it or not, they're cheaper to insure because there's less risk of damage. Cheaper to control. So if you're doing inventory counts, it's a lot easier to count cubes than it is to count randomly shaped watermelons. And of course, cheaper to process and pre-pack because now you can automate that whole process because you have control over the actual input. So again, when you look at this watermelon, is it more appealing on the senses? Is it more durable? Is it of better quality? And the answer really is no, no, and no. And do we care? We don't even care because in this case specifically, we are focused on cost leadership and not on differentiation. This is, of course, a type of product that you can expect served to you at a restaurant where you just see the cutout portions. You're not going to see it in that shape or form at the restaurant. Now then, whether we're going for differentiation or cost leadership, we still need to keep an eye open on all the different supply chain costs or the cost drivers that may arise through design. Now, there are many, many drivers. I'm just showing 5 over here: raw material, product range, product dimensions, product weight, and supply chain service. When I say cost driver, what I mean to say is that if you increase any of those, so if you have more raw material, that means the cost is going to go up. If I have a wider product range, price will go up because you're going to have to store more items, pack differently, and so on. Bigger items, product dimensions, bigger items require more volume to store and to ship, etc. So all this requires more spend. So we're going to focus on these, but there are many, many more or other drivers such as labor, shipping distance, volume, and so on. But let's start by looking at these and starting with the first one, that is raw material. Now, let's take an example, which is wood, okay? So if I had a furniture store and I wanted to produce, let's say, a wooden chair or a table, and say I wanted to produce that in 10 or 12 different colors, what that means is I need to procure 12 different items. I need to store 12 different items. I may have, instead of one, I might have 2, 3, or even 12 different suppliers, 24 if you're considering, your backups, and that's going to be a lot to deal with. So one thing we can do, okay, at the design phase, so when your people sit down to design that table on day one, rather than just throw in a bunch of different, pine wood and maple wood and poplar, etc., one thing you can do is standardize the material that you're actually using. Now, a champion of this practice is, of course, IKEA. IKEA, whether you're buying a table or a chair or a shelf, you're going to find that that's all made up of the same type of wood, which is actually MDF, so medium density fiberboard. And then at the postponement stage, later on in the production factory, that's when they just apply a coat of coloring. So here, when you design your product, think about how to minimize the number of materials that are going to go into that item, because with every additional item, you're adding a level of complexity. A second driver is the product range, and let's talk chocolate, let's talk Kit Kat. So we're all familiar with the original Kit Kat. Kit Kat, obviously, there's a craze in Japan on the different flavors of Kit Kat that they offer. So the strategy Kit Kat or Nestle had in Japan was to pursue a differentiation strategy. So having different flavors. Now with every flavor, of course, you're changing the ingredients. Instead of storing one type of item, now you're storing, let's say, 8 or 10 or 15 items at every stage. So you're storing them at the retail place, you're storing them at the distribution centers, at the manufacturing, and you're storing additional raw material at the various sources of location. Everywhere else, KitKat pursued a cost leadership position, which was basically how do we get the product to the market, and that, of course, was through having a standardized original version. Now, I'm aware that Nestle is differentiating more and more beyond Japan nowadays, but I would like you at this stage to think about the cost implication of having 1 versus 12 different, let's say, flavors, and think about what that means for your supply chain in terms of storage, shipping, handling, and inventory management. The third driver that we're going to talk about today is dimensions, okay, or basically size, the size of the item that you're actually selling. Now, traditionally, we used to, let's say I want to design a new chair. We used to design the chair, build it, and then worry about how to package it. And what we ended up with was all sorts of boxes in different shapes, different forms, some that were difficult to handle. Sometimes you'd need a crane, sometimes you couldn't stack them properly. To solve the problem, we no longer do that, but rather what we do is we start with the box that we want to store the chair in, and we actually move back from there. So again, back to IKEA. What IKEA actually do is they give their designers the size of the box, and they say, listen, create a chair that fits in that box. Now, there's a lot of thinking, not just on that, but there's a lot of thinking on the size of the box itself, because when you produce those boxes and you stack them next to each other, you want to make sure that when they're stacked on a pallet, they are occupying the full pallet. So a typical pallet is a 1 meter by 122 by 120, 1.2 meters. And if I end up occupying only 80 or 90% of that pallet, that means I'm losing potential savings of 10 to 50% on shipping, on storage, and even at the retail level. So dimension is going to be a big thing here when you start designing your product. Another example here for the old timers comes from from the telecom industry. Okay, a lot of you might remember the old Nokia phone, and not just the phone, but the packaging it used to come in. And you can see over here that the box is big enough to store perhaps 4 or 5 different phones. Now compare that to the iPhone, where the size of the package is actually the same size, at least the length and the width of the box is exactly the same size as the phone. There's barely any maneuvering space to put in a couple of fingers to grab the phone out of the packet. And what this does is it actually saves a lot of space. So when it comes time to load those iPhones on a pallet, you can take up to 250% more phones using the iPhone design in a single pallet or container than you could using the traditional Nokia box. So all of this is money, remember, and if you're pursuing a cost leadership strategy, that is going to make a big difference on the outcome. Now, the fourth driver we want to talk about is product weight. So less weight means less supply chain energy consumption. If you have a truck that is driving down the road with 24 tons worth of goods, and another truck driving along with the same quantity of items, but instead of the 24 tons, it's loaded with 5 or 6 tons, that's going to be a lot less stress on the energy consumption of the vehicle, on the tires, on the brakes, and so on. Even the handling equipment that you're using to load and unload the trucks are going to have areas for potential savings. So here, where possible, a lot of companies are moving towards composite materials. Okay, so things like plywood. Okay, things like instead of wood, things like fiberglass instead of plastic, even ceramics. All of these materials. When I say composite, it's usually made of 2 distinct materials. All of these can help not just differentiate, but all of the time they can actually be cheaper and lead to a lower cost structure. Mind you, when I talk about cost in supply chain, it's not just the cost of the items that we're procuring, but it's the cost of procuring the items, shipping them, producing them, delivering them, and even managing the reverse logistics, if that was also a part of your life cycle costs. Now, the fifth and last cost driver we're going to talk about is supply service level. So what we're saying here is that sometimes along with the goods you're selling, the customer expects a certain service level. So am I offering a 5-star service, a 3-star service, or a half-star service? The higher the service level, the higher the cost, and that's why we're implying here that service level is going to be a cost driver indeed. And from a supply chain design perspective or supply chain thinking perspective, what we're looking at here about is delivery and delivery speed and delivery reliability. Now, how do we achieve that? We achieve that by being closer to the customer, by increasing the number of echelons that we are actually have rolled out across our supply chain network. So if, for example, I'm sending everything out of one centralized location in a specific city, I'm going to have to drive a long way to deliver the product to my customers, or they're going to have to drive a long way to get to me. Compare that with having many different smaller distribution locations closer on every street, closer to the customers. That will improve reliability, but at the same time, it's going to increase my cost structure dramatically. So that's going to be also another consideration for how you want to create competitive advantage. Is it through differentiation, or is it through cost leadership? So that's basically sums it up. So we discussed competitive advantage, we discussed design for the supply chain, and we've discussed how we can actually create competitive advantage through design for the supply chain. Thank you for watching. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this topic or more on supply chain in general, please feel free to visit our website at meirc.com, where you're going to find the complete listing of our supply chain courses. Thank you very much. And I'm just reading through the questions here. Absolutely, we'll be sending you a copy of the presentation, Hani, and thank you for your positive feedback.
Meirc.com